Hi, so I'm Zach, and as I was just introduced, I'm a creative technologist and designer, and I've just started a PhD at Lancaster University in November actually, and this whole project really was something I started in my undergraduate degree, and it's something which I've sort of built on and adapted for this conference really because I felt that it sort of fitted, but it needed a lot of reworking and adaptation to make it to work for how this whole conference was um, sort of laid out. So I want to start off by talking about where this project started, like the older project, and I'll move on to like some artists that have influenced me to make it, and then where I adapted this older project and made it into something which fit within this. So it started out with this project which was called Objects in Liminal Space, and it was exploring how we can bring objects between digital and physical spaces and how their sentiment and like meaning changes between these spaces. And so I was making things like audio visual synthesizers, which would turn visual data into sound. And I was replicating these Utah teapots, which is like a synonymous shape with digital environments, and eroding them through photogrammetry, which is a process of taking lots of images of an object to put it into software and allow the software to make a 3D model of that shape. And then I would 3D print these back out and make them into objects, which I again scan through and erode them over time through digital processes. And this idea moved on to looking at uncanny objects and how we can draw digital space and use digital space to make objects from mental space and physical space, and how we can clarify those through digital space and use that as a method to generate objects. So that teapot idea came into this object, which didn't really have a name or a defining name. And I started trying to like make it tangible and make it an object which you could physically hold in real life. And I used 3D printing again to look at this. And I think this project made me think about this idea of data and how we can look further at data and make that into something movable and physical. And that was really important for this whole idea. And so from that, I moved on to this, which was a look at this entire project as a whole and the data that I created from it and how I could rationally display this. So I was using this piece of software called Gram Perspective, and it essentially shows you like a file structure on your computer and allows you to visually display like the size of files and the age of them. And so this image here, the height essentially displays how old the files are, and the volume or a surface area of each block becomes is the size of the files. And so I created this into a 3D object again, and then I used plaster and clay to make it into a fossil, which you can see in the bottom right. And that was sort of the moment which sparked this entire project, because I was thinking about how a fossil might look in the future. Like what would a fossil be in the future, like from our time, and how, not necessarily how would that physically be, but how would we regard it? And the way we regard fossils now is maybe the way that we would regard these sort of digital data and artifacts in the future. And so that moment came really into play later in the project. But then I started looking really at machine learning and AI, which was really where these two ideas came together. And so I used a style GAN, which I think Anna talks about quite a bit earlier, but essentially it's a generic facial generating system. And I basically retrained a generic style GAN with images of my own face, which you can see on the left is the original style GAN, and then this right is how these same outputs come out when it's been retrained. And I used images of my own face, which my phone recognized. And from that, I didn't crop the images. I just left them as is and let them machine pre-trained algorithm determine how it would interpret this, which is sort of how I wanted to remove myself from the control and let the algorithm dictate where it would draw the images and make it more about data than visually striking images. But this project I think became too dictated by myself, because I ended up with this output, which is one of the images, the output images from that GAN that I trained. And I tried to make this into a sculpture, but again, like taking too much artistic control myself. This was the endpoint that I came to at the end of my undergraduate. And I think, although very visually striking, it doesn't have as much impact with data and using digital space and alternative space to represent that data. And that's where I got a bit lost. And then I started looking quite a lot at these other artists who've done really similar things, which are really interesting. And the first one of those was Tom White, this project called Perception Engines, which uses an object recognition algorithm. And he has essentially made these drawings which the machine recognizes as like household objects. So I think there's a tap in there, there's a hairdryer, a lamp, and a sewing machine. And these are recognized by the algorithm as those specific objects, these drawings. But he is drawn as simple or as abstract shapes he can, which the machine will detect as those objects, which in itself was incredibly fascinating to me, because manipulating the machine or letting the machine take control and him becoming like a subservient of that is quite fascinating. And the next artist actually does quite a similar thing, which is Dries de Porter, Face Detected. And this project uses artists and gets them to sculpt faces. And then from these sculpted faces, there's a machine learning algorithm again trained to, and it's watching the artist produce these sculptures. And then at the point where it recognizes a facial image or a face within that sculpture, the artist is asked to stop by the little screen you can see on the left image there, and it'll say like face detected, and then that's the end point of the project. And that became quite similar to my previous project. And I realized that what I'd failed to do was allow the machine to gain control, because by giving the machine the control, it meant that you were saying more about what the machine output and what the machine like patterns were, rather than trying to gain control of myself. And the final really interesting project, which sort of influenced this new way of looking at this set of data in the AI, was the project, which is essentially they take data from users or people, and they get them to talk about their loved ones that they've actually lost, and they talk about them over time, and they take different data points. So they take beta and gamma waves from the brain, and they take their voice and heartbeat, and then from this they extrapolate these graphs or data points. And the vertical axis within these objects you can see on the left are the time axis, and then everything else is the fluctuation of their mind state throughout talking about someone they really care about. And these create vessels or objects to inhabit like a physical space. And this translation from something completely mental to something which is entirely objective through digital means is something that I need to implement more and like focus on the data side of it to really lessen my own agenda and to allow the machine algorithm to speak for itself. And so I began looking back at the same data set and generating outputs. And I ended up again like overbearing my artistic like intent and creating quite like visually diverse and fascinating visuals, but again twisting the data too much to what I needed. And so I started to think about how I could reduce this impact that I had on the data and how I could let it almost take control entirely itself. So I decided to take the GAN that I created and lay it out into a grid. So I generated like 999 images, which I put into a 33 by 33 grid. And these were from the GAN that I trained earlier on. And this is the set of images which I didn't choose this time. I let the machine learning algorithm I think it was every like 5 minutes, I took a still from it while it generated in this latent spacewalk. And then I just displayed these images in this grid, as you can see. And then using a deformation map within Blender, I lowered and raised the vertices of specific points within like a plane, similar to, again, what Anna was doing earlier. But rather than me choosing the deformation myself, I was allowing the color data from these pixels to dictate entirely what the shape would be. So this ends up with a visual which is the background to all these slides actually, but on the next slide you can see it created like a desert landscape, which it felt to me like a desert landscape anyway. And I wanted to make this feels like something which could be like in the real world, because I think as pure data, getting away from pure data is important. And I think that would have been the whole aim of the project. So I was trying to conceptualize how I would make this into something, like how I'd scale it and how I would output it. So this project kind of had two endings, and one which fits in this digital exhibition environment was this game engine space, which was, I used Photogrammetry again to make myself the character of this game. And then I put myself in the space and put a simple desert texture over the entire environment. And it meant you can walk through it and experience it on quite a small scale and move through it. And in this way, I think is what's interesting is you don't tend to notice the patterns, but in the second variation, which I'll show now, I 3D printed the same object, and I think the way in which you can see the difference between these two perspectives on the same exact object and same exact data sets, depending on the environment they're in, from digital to physical, is really stark. Because in that digital, like ground level environment, you see it as like an infinite vast landscape, but in this way you can tell that it's just a tile of this massive machine learning algorithm that you have no control over. And I think the way that difference is very much like the intrigue of this entire project, and on where I would take it further as I progress with exploring and researching digital and physical spaces and the way we can work across them. And so where I would go next with this would be just exploring more tactility and VR, and how we can integrate virtual realities, not just as a classic like VR standpoint, but also create virtual spaces and virtual environments which are physically engaging and distort the perspective from which we can see these sets of data or these images, or however we want to regard the outputs or inputs of what we make. And so I think that's where I want to go next. And that's all I have to say, really. Thanks for listening.